In the wake of the Cold War, the United States decided that they needed to address this burgeoning Cold War. And one of the things that the United States started to come up with was the strategy of containment. So, containment was a strategy developed by a long-standing diplomat for the State Department, George F. Kennan. And Kennan developed the idea of containment while serving as a diplomat in Moscow. He was stationed in many different places in his life, including Latin America. His diaries are really interesting. So Kennan made the argument that the United States should not try to roll back communism, that the Soviet Union was too large and too powerful, and we really couldn't do that without starting World War III. So instead, Kennan, in his famous lawn telegram, decided that the best course of action for the United States would be to contain or stop the spread of communism, to prevent any more nation states in the world from embracing communism as their political ideology. Kennan felt that that was a much more achievable goal, and that's actually going to be the overarching foreign policy for the duration of the Cold War. So buckle up, we're going to be talking about containment for the vast majority of the rest of this series. So the idea of containment is formally expressed in 1947 by Harry Truman in what he calls the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine was Harry Truman applying the policy of containment in response to growing concerns of political unrest in places like Greece and Turkey. In Greece and Turkey, there was a sense during this rebuilding time after World War II of some folks who wanted to dabble in more leftist political ideas like communism. And in the case of both Greece and Turkey, these were people from Greece and Turkey advocating for this. Nevertheless, Harry Truman and others saw this as a potential for the expansion of communism. And in the Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman will commit formally and publicly to a policy of containment, promising that the United States will provide aid to any nation. As he puts it, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. So when Truman issues this doctrine on March 12, 1947, this formalizes the idea of containment policy, and thus 1947 is often cited as the beginning of the Cold War because that is when Truman formally adopts a policy of containment. So what does containment look like realistically during this early phase of the Cold War? Well, the very first thing that a lot of these Western nations are concerned about is making sure that communism isn't appealing to these rebuilding nations. Because people in times of desperation and despair and facing a long process of rebuilding generally are more willing to experiment with more extreme political ideas. So the fact that Europe is literally in ruins, many places are still having to ration supplies, makes the Allies very worried that communism might find a foothold in Western Europe as well. So the United States commits to an economic development plan called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was named after former General and then Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and the Marshall Plan provided $13 billion in 1948 money, not today's money, $13 billion to rebuild infrastructure and help the economy get back on its feet in Western European nations. So the idea was if we give them aid money, they will rebuild faster, therefore they will be less tempted by communism. The Soviets' response, because the theme of the Cold War is anything you can do, I can do better, the Soviets' response is their own assistance program called Comecon, or the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. They found that one in 1949, a year later. And similarly, this is aid money to rebuild the economies and the infrastructure of Eastern European nations. Comecon also tried to encourage trade within the Soviet sphere of influence, discourage trade with Western nations to try to minimize the amount of capitalist democratic influence in Eastern Europe. So, as we've already mentioned, Germany is divided because people are deathly afraid that Germany will start crap again. And Eastern Germany and Eastern Berlin are controlled by the Soviet Union, whereas West Germany and West Berlin are divided into three pieces between the French, the British, and the Americans. Where this starts to get a bit sticky is in 1948. So the Allies start to propose, at least the Western part of the Allies, start to propose that Germany, Western Germany, should be unified. So, in other words, like the Eastern section is only controlled by the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to unify Western German zones into one. So, when the American, French, and the British occupation zones in West Germany and West Berlin officially become unified, the Soviet Union responds with a blockade of Berlin. So, Berlin previously had been connected to West Germany via certain sanctioned travel corridors, and the Soviet Union basically shuts that down. Nobody can get in or out of West Berlin. They are cut off from the outside world, starting on June 24th, 1948. American and British military respond to this blockade with the Berlin airlift, which will last for nearly a full year and sees the British and the American militaries using planes to airdrop supplies into Western Berlin. The Soviets will only cease the blockade in May of 1949 after seeing that the Allies are willing to sustain this airlift as long as is necessary. In May 1949, the Western occupied zones officially merge and become the Federal Republic of Germany, better known as West Germany. And in the East, in response to this, the Soviets grant Eastern Germany its own nation status, and they become known as the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Berlin will still remain divided into West and East Berlin, with West Berlin technically belonging to West Germany, East Berlin for East Germany. Okay. Germany will remain divided until the end of the Cold War, and still today you can see the lingering effects of this division if you go and visit Germany. Now, with the two new Germanys forming as nation states, there's a concern over militarization in Europe. The Soviet Union, understandably, is a little nervous about having Germany in any form exist again on their western border after being invaded repeatedly by Germany in two world wars. And so there's this desire to try to shore up their defenses in the event of an attack. The same is true in Western Europe as well. Western Europe is very aware of the potential for expansion of communism because in the OG or original communism, this basically says you have to have a worldwide revolution for the revolution to truly be successful. Now, that's not really the case in the Soviet Union. They haven't really adopted that we must expand across the world brand of communism, but there is this very real fear in the West that they might. So the Western nations gather together to form NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is established in 1949 and led originally by the United States and included member nations like Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal. And as of 1955, when they're allowed to rearm again, Western Germany will join NATO as well. And NATO still exists today. The Soviets again developed their own military alliance system in 1955 after Western Germany is allowed to rearm, and they call this the Warsaw Pact. So it's similarly made up of the Soviet Union and communist nations in Eastern Europe. This is especially relevant because in 1949, the Soviet Union develops their own atomic bomb. So the United States no longer is the only nation with atomic weaponry in the world. Now both sides of the Cold War have atomic weapons, and many other nation states will also successfully develop their own atomic weapons programs as well during the 1950s and 1960s.